I'd like to start off by wishing my daughter a happy birthday. Uh, she turned 5 today, so she was born just on the eve of the occupation of Iraq. And in fact, that kind of is a good segue into the beginning of my story. My wife was 9 months pregnant as the war was getting started, and in fact, we had to induce labor in order for me to be there for the birth of my daughter, Ivy. I actually felt very fortunate to have been able to take part in that experience. It's really one of the highlights of my life to be able to look back on that and to have not missed out. It's really a wonderful thing. Unfortunately, I went from that beautiful, loving experience into the jaws of the heat and the stressors of the occupation in Iraq. I landed just a couple of days later in Kuwait, and it was the very beginning of the war, so Baghdad had not fallen. They still had Scud missiles. They were still using them quite regularly, I might add. And at that point, we didn't know if they had chemical warheads. We didn't know if mustard gas was attached or some other weapons of mass destruction. Obviously, later on, it became apparent that they didn't. But we were still, every time the air raid sirens went off, notifying us that there was a Scud missile coming in, we were still donning our gas masks and putting on our chemical suits and making our way to these bunkers as quickly as possible. And despite the fact that this was, for many of for many soldiers, for many of the people who were there, probably one of the most terrifying experiences of their lives. While we were doing that, while my camp was under attack, people were hiding in these bunkers. There was a female soldier who was in the showers and didn't hear the sirens and was attacked by a male soldier and raped while everybody else was running for their lives. So you can imagine that this situation, all these stressors, definitely bring out the worst in people. And this was just the beginning, the very eve of what was to come. Later on during the occupation, I was on a convoy, and we were moving from one base to another. It was very typical to do this. A convoy is really one of the more dangerous times that you can be, one of the more dangerous activities that you can do in Iraq, because you're exposing yourself. A lot of the attacks happen while you're driving down the road. And on this particular day, I was the commander's driver, and I was seated in the 9 o'clock position. And I heard over the radio a report of shots being fired. We had incoming sniper fire at 9 o'clock, right where I was seated. So I took a deep breath and kind of prepared for the worst, and then just seconds later, I heard shots from my left side. So I immediately locked and loaded my M16 and swung it into position, all while I was driving, of course, and looked for a target. They teach you in basic training that if you don't have a target, you're not supposed to shoot. But there is this mindset that you should lay down suppressive fire if you get shot at to get anybody out there so they'll put their heads down and stop firing at you. But what I faced was an urban environment. There's buildings, there's trees, there's civilians walking around, women, children, what have you. So I'm faced with the decision and my commander's sitting right next to me, so I have to decide, am I going to lay down suppressive fire at this point in hopes of getting the sniper to put his head down, or, and chance shooting somebody unintentionally who is not shooting at me? And, I did the mental calculation in my head and said, there's a better chance I'm going to hit somebody who's not trying to harm me than I'm going to hit somebody who is. And so I didn't pull the trigger. And I was very fortunate in that nobody was hurt, and I wasn't hurt. But I was also fortunate in that coming home from Iraq, I was able to look back and know that I hadn't pulled the trigger. So I never had to wonder, like some of my brothers in arms and sisters in arms, about whether or not I had killed anybody, which is a heavy burden to bear, and one that shouldn't be taken lightly. In fact, on another convoy, I had a lieutenant who was unusually trigger happy. He would go through a box of ammunition about once a week, which is easily several hundred rounds of ammunition. And I usually carried an M16, being an enlisted soldier, but he had a 9mm, and he handed it to me. I was in the back of a Humvee, and he was in the front, and said, "I want you to shoot at that guy behind us." And I said, "What for?" And he said, "Well, he's tailgating." And I thought to myself, well, that's an awfully odd thing to do. I didn't feel like we were in any threat. He was tailgating in the same manner that almost every third world driver I've ever ridden with tailgates, just kind of aggressive, typical bad driving. And I chose to ignore the order. I could have lost pay, I could have lost rank, I could have gotten in an awful lot of trouble, but I felt that my command would back me up if it came to that, and I felt that he was making a bad call. And I must have been right, because he didn't make an issue of it. Lastly, I would like to say to the American people, I'd like to plead with you to please take a step forward, take action, join us in our fight, wake yourselves up from the apathy. We need help. The only way we're going to end this war is just a tidal wave of public opinion, the people coming out and speaking out and saying to the government, this occupation must end now. Thank you.